Okay guys, as promised, here is a slightly longer intro to Revelation, a bit of a broad brush intro to Revelation, asking the question, how do we begin to read and understand the book of Revelation as a whole? In our series, we're actually concentrating on the first half of Revelation, but let's think here about 7 things. Revelation loves the number 7, so I'm going to give you 7 things that I think you need to know in order to read Revelation helpfully. So first one, how do we begin? Fear not. Fear not. We don't need to fear the book of Revelation. We don't need to be scared of reading it, and we shouldn't be using it to scare others or to scare ourselves. If the book of Revelation makes you deeply scared primarily, then you're probably reading it wrong. Fear not is the emphatic repetition throughout it. Number 2, read it with others. Read it in a community. That's a bit harder at the moment, isn't it? The Bible, though, should always be read in community, and that's a really special, kind of helpful safety catch for us, so that we don't go off in down wrong paths. We need to read it with others, so at times we can be corrected or can correct others. It can be good to have a good Bible teacher with you. I've been using a number of books and commentaries. I'll mention just a few of them here. A really short book that I found helpful, a really great introduction to the book of Revelation, just a couple of quid, by Ian Paul, How to Read the Book of Revelation. I'll refer to that in a moment. And his slightly bigger commentary. It's not a huge commentary. It's got enough detail to really give you what you need to know, but not overwhelming. There's others that I've used by a guy called G.K. Beale, which is good, but very big and draws on the Greek text. Let me give you, in fact, a little quote from Ian. So Ian is a biblical theologian, so you learn some really helpful things from him that you wouldn't otherwise. For example, Ian talks about Revelation's use of numbers, particularly the number 7. He says, in the ancient world, 7 suggested completeness, since there were 7 days in a week, 7 seas, and 7 known planets. These particular 7 symbolised these churches symbolised the whole of the earlier Christian movement, and the letter, therefore, was relevant to all the churches. So even though John mentions only 7 churches here, it was relevant to all of them. Let me mention one other thing about numbers. So he talks about how Revelation uses what we might call square numbers, triangular numbers, and rectangular numbers. Sounds odd? Stay with it. Revelation draws on square numbers because of the distinctive shape of the Hebrew altars in the Old Testament. The shape of the Holy of Holies was a cube, we see in 1 Kings 6:20. And the square and cubic numbers 144 and 1,000 designate the things of God, particularly the people of God. By contrast, the triangular number 666 designates the opponent of God. So huge things in there I would not have learnt on my own. Another book I've come across, a really helpful one by Eugene Peterson. This is called Reversed Thunder. Eugene Peterson is not primarily working as a biblical theologian, but really more of a pastor. So he's thinking about, what does this book mean for us now? What does it mean for people to read? How should we respond to it? Let me just mention a couple of things he says. I'll read a few bits to you from him. He's talking about how John, the writer of Revelation, is a theologian. He says, the task of theologians is to demonstrate a gospel order in the chaos of evil, so they can be perceived coherently. Sin, defeat, discouragement, prayer, suffering, persecution, praise, politics, they're all placed in relation to the realities of God and Christ. Holiness and healing, heaven and hell, victory and judgment, beginning and ending. And so the theologian John, his achievement is that the community, us, can live by faith in Christ, continue to live with a reasonable hope and an intelligent love. He later talks about how John is a poet, and he talks about poets use words not to explain something and not to describe, but to make. The word poet, poetes, means maker. Poetry is not the language of objective explanation, but the language of imagination. It makes an image of reality in such a way as to invite our participation in it. Now, he's not saying that what's written about in Revelation isn't real. He's just saying there's an invitation into the kind of imagination of John as we see his vision. There's various other books that I've used. One here talking about the different ways of interpreting, 4 ways of interpreting Revelation. Andrew Wilson, part of New Frontiers Churches, did a summer school last year on it. The Bible Project's got some great stuff to engage with Revelation. And in terms of thinking about it through church history, City of God gives us a glimpse as to how Augustine maybe engaged with some of the things in Revelation, or other church fathers. And you might want to think about eschatology more broadly. Why am I showing you all that? I'm just making the point, really, we shouldn't be reading the Bible on our own. And all Bible teachers need to be speaking into us. And as someone who's trying to teach the Bible, I need that input as well. So, fear not, number 1. Number 2, read it with others. Number 3, consider the genre. So all writing has a genre. Let me make a point about this one from Ian Paul's book, if I can find it. How to read the book of Revelation. Here we go. So what genre is this? The stars will fall from heaven. The sun will cease its shining. The moon will be turned to blood, and fire and hail will fall from heaven. The rest of the country will have sunny intervals with scattered showers. Did you hear the change of genre in that? All writing has a genre, whether it's a text message or a letter, a story, a weather app. They're all read in different ways, and so we need to think, what is the genre? I'm going to give you 3. So A, this book of Revelation is a letter. It's written to 7 real churches, so it must have made sense to them. It couldn't primarily have been about Hitler or the coronavirus or any of the other things that have come in our recent or far history, because that wouldn't have helped or challenged or encouraged them. We have to consider primarily it was written to them. It's written, of course, for us, but to them. B, it's prophetic. Like the Old Testament revealed God's will, this is what it's doing. Not necessarily all predictive prophecy. Much prophecy in the Bible, the vast majority, is revealing God's will, not predicting the future, although some does. And there's 2 prophetic themes. There's the theme, don't be scared, fear not. Jesus and his church will win. So those of us who need encouragement, there's the prophetic theme that comes through. Second prophetic theme is don't compromise. Don't compromise your faith. Don't give in to culture, popular worldviews, idolatry. Stay faithful. So A, it's a letter. B, it's prophetic. C, it's apocalyptic. It's unveiling something. This genre of literature is something we don't really read anymore, but was very popular amongst the Jewish people just before the writing of the New Testament. It was really influenced by the Old Testament prophets, particularly Daniel. And apocalyptic literature, which Revelation is a kind of, tends to be highly metaphorical. Now, that doesn't mean it's not real. It's talking about real truths, but when it uses beasts and prostitutes and dragons, they are metaphors to emphasize the truth. It usually reinterprets Scripture, so often bring in Scripture and Bible characters and give us a kind of new glimpse on what they mean. It's often got a heavenly journey involved, and we see John taken up into heaven here, and it's often eschatological. It's often about the end. It's often to do with the future, the hope and the ultimate destiny of the world, which of course parts of Revelation are. So it's a letter, helps us realize it's not about necessarily predictions. It's prophetic, that helps us realize the challenge and the encouragement. It's apocalyptic, and that helps us know that it's okay. This is quite hard to understand. It's not kind of literature we read anymore. Don't be worried if you're not getting it all. Number 4 then, how do we interpret Revelation? Usually when we interpret the Bible, we go through a few steps. We think about the original context. What did this mean when it was written by Isaiah to the Jewish people in exile in Babylon? What did it mean when Paul wrote it from prison to this Greek audience? So we think about the original meaning, and then we jump to secondly, what maybe are the timeless truths that can still apply to us. Yeah, we're not in exile, we're not in Babylon, we're not getting this from someone in prison, but what does it tell us about God for now? And then we also might think about how other Christians through history have interpreted it. The problem with Revelation is people have often jumped that first step. Very often people don't actually look at what did it mean to the original audience, just jump straight to what does this mean for us now? And that's quite dangerous. So I want to help us understand kind of 3 ways that Revelation can be interpreted. It could be 4 ways, we could say. but let me give you A, B, and C. So A, we need to look at it in its original context. Sometimes this is called preterist. And so what we're asking is, what did it mean then? So a preterist reading of Revelation would say, hang on, the temple was destroyed in AD 70. That might be relevant. Hang on, there were a lot of idols worshipped in Ephesus. There were springs in Laodicea. In Pergamum, there was a particular colour of stone that was famous. There was idolatry in Thyatira. There was architecture and history going on here. What does it help us understand about the original audience and what we're saying to them? I think that's a really important step. B is an idealist approach. It thinks about what are the timeless truths about God, Jesus, evil, Christians. The idealist approach is so important. Really how we come to apply it. We might think, it might remind us that actually all generations have temptation to compromise. It will remind us that Christians have a hope in the new heavens and earth. It will tell us that all empires and institutions can become corrupted. And so we've got an approach looking at the original context, and we've got an approach looking at timeless truths. I think we need both of those. The third approach is what I might call a bit of an almanac approach, looking forwards like it's a crystal ball, or looking backwards, a kind of timeline. So looking forwards, people might be asking, what's going to happen next? Is this predicting the future? Is this the apocalypse? Is this the sign of the beast? Some people have been talking, even recently within the coronavirus, about 5G being related to the coronavirus, and maybe then even linking it to things in Revelation. I think this is pretty unhelpful. Or if we're looking backwards, you might be thinking, well, what's happened? Let's track world events through the timelines in Revelation. I think it's not generally helpful, and it can be quite damaging. But because Revelation does tell us timeless truths, we shouldn't be surprised if we look back in history, or even think about tomorrow, that we will see truths about God, truths about evil, and truths about how God will act. There always have been wars, violence, famine, and persecution. The church has always had victory through worship despite suffering, and so there are things that we can see. So I think we need to really be using a preterist and idealist approach. One commentator, Peter Leithart, not sure how to pronounce his name, says that really Revelation is the heavenly view of what happens in Acts. Acts give us the earthly view of what they can see, and Revelation gives us a heavenly view. Now, I would want to nuance that slightly, because Revelation does speak about things going into the future, but I think that gives us a helpful sense of the book of Revelation. Moving quickly, number 5 then, what's the structure of Revelation? Well, there are millions out there. Let me give you one helpful one. Chapter 1 to 3 is Jesus unveiled. We get the 7 letters there. Jesus unveiled, chapters 1 to 3. Chapters 4 to 16, the largest part, is God's throne unveiled. We see worship, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 visions, 7 bowls. God's throne unveiled. Chapter 17 to 21 is the harlot or prostitute unveiled. And the 7 events that take place there. Wait to hear more about that. And then the last section, chapter 21 to 22, is God's bride, Christ's bride, unveiled. So Jesus unveiled, God's throne unveiled, the harlot unveiled, the bride unveiled. Number 6, Revelation is a narrative, it's a story. And so I think it can be good to think about some of the themes, some of the stories that we see throughout that. We could, for example, view it as a romance. Jesus, the bridegroom, comes for his bride, Israel, who has become a harlot. But he rescues the harlot and makes her into his bride. So God's bride, Israel, has become the prostitute. That's one interpretation. And an important reminder for us that actually all of us can be unfaithful to God. The modern day church needs to use that, needs to hear that. So we might want to think about this as a romance. Another way we might think about the story of Revelation is victory. Nike, the word where we get Nike from. As Christians, we already know that Jesus has won, but Revelation tells us that the church wins. The church will triumph. We do have a part to play through faithful witness, through persevering worship. The church is saved by the blood of the Lamb, but the church is significantly involved in the spiritual battle and the destruction of the devil, actually. And the church conquers, but not without suffering. Just like that Nike swoosh And this is an Andrew Wilson analogy. The Christian life often has suffering and difficulty, but there is victory to come. So it's a romance, it's about victory, it's about exile. God brings his people out of exile in Babylon, the world, into a heavenly city. Revelation, if you like, is the new true Ezra and Nehemiah story. And it's a liturgy. Revelation is a call to worship. It's calling us to worship. There's benediction, there's doxology, there's amazing pictures that are calling us out in a story to worship. Finally then, it's just some key ideas. Number 7, key ideas that we need for interpreting Revelation. All of the language of Revelation has been really carefully crafted. John has had a vision, and he found it so hard to explain what he sees in the vision. He does his best with language to craft and help us see it. And it's filled with Old Testament things, Old Testament allusions, Old Testament quotes. The numbers also mean something in Revelation, and we've talked about already that 7 means completion or fulfillment. 12 usually represents creation. And there's other things related to numbers you might want to look out. Revelation is surprising. There's a huge element of surprise. John is told to hear something. He turns round and he sees something different. He's surprised. There's almost like a sensory overload as we read the book of Revelation. It is surprising. The colour white, I'm not sure if white is really a colour, I'd say the absence of colour. I think it's a combination of all colours actually, because white represents the nations. When you put all the colours together, all the nations together, you get God's church pure and undefiled. It's when all nations come together. I think an important idea to recognise is that Jesus reverses our military expectations. We have a non-violent Jesus in many ways here. Jesus has a sword in his mouth and a message in his hand. We would expect a sword in his hand and a message in his mouth, but he doesn't. There's a sword in his mouth. His words speak to us, and he has a message in his hand. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, Revelation is full of metaphors. Metaphors piled on top of metaphors. This makes it vivid. It's shocking. It really helps us use our imagination to understand God and the world, but we need to be careful with them to try and really grasp what they mean, read what different people are saying, hopefully engage in these, and we'll share some of what I'm reading as well. That has been a very fast, quick tour through an intro to Revelation. You've maybe had to pause and take your breath, but hopefully 7 things that will help us as a church as we go through the book of Revelation. As I mentioned on the intro video, if you want to send in questions and you're part of Gateway Church, connecting with us regularly, and we know you, then that's great. You can send them to sam.evans@gatewayleeds.net. See you later.